Good morning. Welcome to Manito United Methodist virtual service. We're glad you could join us. Won't you come in?
Good morning and welcome to Manito United Methodist Church. We are so glad that you're here to worship with us virtually this morning. Please join me in our call to worship. You show up, risen Lord, in unexpected places.
In the strangers we meet on the road, in the breaking of bread with strangers.
You show up, risen Lord, in unexpected places.
Help us to have eyes to see you, ears to hear you, and hearts that perceive your presence.
Please join us in our gathering song, Good Christian Friends Rejoice.
Announcements to share with you this week. Manito's website has a new look, so please go ahead and check that out at manitoumc.org. We'll be adding more things to our page over the coming months, but we wanted to go ahead and get it up and going in this season where we're worshiping virtually. Our church will continue to worship virtually through May 3rd. We have not received an updated directive from the bishop at this time, but the church will continue to update its community members regarding any extension of the bishop's directive or the governor's order and its effects on our church community as they are received. The physical office of the church continues to remain closed due to the stay home, stay healthy order of our governor. Our staff is still monitoring the email and voicemail messages that are left Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. If you'd love a chance to connect with your Manito church community, please consider joining us for our Zoom fellowship coffee hour. It happens after our virtual service each week, usually at about 11 a.m. So if you'd like to join us, please email me, pastordetienne@gmail.com, and I'll send you the information on how to get involved. We're still trying to find ways to serve others in our community. If you've been looking for a way to help, why not consider making a donation to one of our ministry partners? Each week, the church office sends out an updated list of donation needs for Shalom Ministries and Family Promise. And then we have a dedicated group of volunteers who meet each Wednesday in the parking lot on 33rd across the street from the church building from 1:30 to 2 p.m. They're there to receive your donations, and then they will transport those donations to Shalom Ministries and Family Promise. Let's take a moment to join one another in prayer. Please remember to keep our Manito friends, family, and loved ones in your prayers this week. We have prayers for protection for Cynthia Ramoff's sister, Dr. Laura Kirkman, Doug and Tiffany Adams, Evelyn Torkelson's brother, Larry Barty, Sheila and Pam, Dolores Sauer, Tim Rundquist, Shelley Cuny, Jill Longmire, Eleanor Miller, Wes and Peggy Ackerman's granddaughter, Keely Ray Bond, and Peggy's sister, Marion Meek. Prayers for Jody Lever, Sue Plummer's sister, Darla DeCristoforo, Dave Grenig, Phyllis Everest, and Mike Jackson. Please join me in prayer. God, we are grateful that we get to gather together to worship virtually this week. As it continues to feel like our world keeps on changing, sometimes we struggle to keep up. But you are our refuge and strength, our very present help in times of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth change, though our country, state, and city changes, we will not fear, for you are with us. God, this day we lift up those who are especially vulnerable in this community. For those who need access to housing and medical care. We think of our medical personnel, our first responders, military, civil service employees, sanitation workers, farmers, truckers, and utility workers. We give you thanks for them. We give you thanks for their service in these difficult times. God, we lift up our postal workers, those continuing to make deliveries, the individuals working at our grocery stores, pharmacies, and banks. God, we give you thanks for and lift up all of our teachers and students. Lord, I recognize that when we gather together in worship, we come with so many things on our hearts and minds. First, we want to give you thanks for the many good and joyful things that you have blessed us with, and we take a moment to silently lift our thanks to you for those gifts now. God, we carry many burdens with us into this place. We are burdened by things happening in our own community and world, burdened by things happening in our own lives and in the lives of those we love and care about. God, in this moment of silence, we lift up the burdens on our hearts to you in prayer. God, we lift up our community, country, and the world. We ask that you would be at work, bringing your justice, hope, and peace where they are absent. Help us to partner with you in your kingdom work. Please join me in the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Please join me in singing Just a Closer Walk with Thee.
Satisfied
just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be.
Our scripture reading today comes to us from the New Testament, Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles outside of Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" And they stood, looking sad. And then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some of the women in our group astounded us. They were at the tomb this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen visions of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and scriptures. And they came near to the village to which they were going, as he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and then he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, "Weren't our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up, returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. And they were saying, "The Lord is risen indeed. He has appeared to Simon." Then they told what happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Holy wisdom, holy word.
Thanks be to God.
Sometimes when I read the stories of our biblical text, I like to imagine myself in the midst of the scene, on board the boat when Jesus calms the wind and the waves, running to the tomb with the other women on that first Easter morning, or walking on the road to Emmaus. But when I do this, when I imagine myself in the midst of the biblical story, I run into the same problem every time. Every time I imagine myself in one of those stories, I always imagined that I would be much smarter and more faithful than the other characters in the text. I find myself wondering, how did they not see it? Why couldn't they believe it? How could they have not known? Do you ever do that? Assume that you would have done things differently if you had been the one in the story? It's easy to do that, isn't it? Because we know how the story ends. But what I often forget is that the characters in these stories didn't have the same information or perspective that I do today. They were in the middle of the story, and they didn't know how it was going to end. So of course, their perspective is going to be different from my own. They are just doing the best they can with what they have. You and I can always imagine ourselves as more enlightened or involved than the characters in our stories. But the truth is that in our own lives, we are often just as in the dark, mistaken, scared, or unfaithful as the next person. Because when you and I are in the middle of our own stories, it's hard to have perspective. We are all doing the best we can with what we have. When you or I know how a story ends, it's so much easier to decide what the right thing to do, say, or believe would be. But when we are in the middle of the story, when we don't know the ending, it's so much harder to know what the right thing to do, say, or believe might be. It's all about perspective, isn't it? The first time Britt took me home for a holiday while we were dating was at Thanksgiving. Britt has a large extended family, and they get together for most, if not all, holidays. DeTienne family gatherings are always full of yummy, home-cooked food with an equal or greater amount of homemade desserts, pies, cookies, and fudge. Their family gatherings start sometime in the mid-afternoon and usually go on into the evening. And at my first Thanksgiving, a large group of us were sitting around the kitchen table when Wyatt, one of Britt's cousin's children, crawled right up into his sister's lap. It was such a sweet moment. No one had expected for Wyatt to warm up so quickly to another adult, but he was just as happy as a clam sitting there on Lindsay's lap. From Wyatt's point of view, he wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, because unbeknownst to us, Wyatt thought he had crawled up in his own mother's lap. You see, my sister-in-law, Lindsay, was blonde and around the same height as his mother, so Wyatt had seen a blonde about the same height and size as his mom and figured it was her. So he crawled up to sit in what he assumed to be his mother's lap. And Wyatt was quite happy, because from Wyatt's perspective, he was on his mother's lap. That was until his mom walked around the corner. And I wish you could have seen the look on little Wyatt's face. I will never forget it. His eyes got really wide when he saw his mom across the room, because at that moment, Wyatt's perspective changed. And he realized he was not sitting on his mother's lap like he had assumed. Wyatt turned around ever so slowly to take a look at the face of the imposter mother's lap. And upon confirming that this person was definitely not his mother, he ever so slowly and deliberately got down from Lindsay's lap and ran straight for his mom. But until his mom walked around the corner, Wyatt had assumed he knew exactly what was going on in the story of his life. From his perspective, he had been sitting on his mother's lap that entire time, until his mother came around the corner and changed his perspective entirely. Some of you may have your own stories like this, stories about your own toddler hugging the legs of a stranger thinking it was you, only to look up and see the face of a stranger. Or perhaps you've gotten into what you thought was your car in the parking lot, only to realize that it wasn't your car. I was at a friend's one night for a girls' night, and one of the women attending our gathering ran into the wrong house, announcing, "I'm arrived! I'm ready for girls' night!" And then she looked around the room and realized that the stunned faces were not those of her friends, but of a family that she didn't even know. She had run into the wrong house. And I would guess that the same thing goes for our individuals on the road. They may have said or done things differently if they had known who was on the road with them or how the story would end, but they didn't know. So I hope you and I can approach the story in our text today with a little grace, with a little less judgment, because we don't know how we would have handled the situation if we were in the middle of it, if we didn't know the end of the story. As I mentioned last week, no one woke up that first Easter morning believing that Jesus had risen from the dead. All of Jesus' followers had assumed he was still lying dead in his tomb. So when the women who had gone to care for Jesus' dead body came running back to tell Jesus' other followers that the tomb was in fact empty and that they had seen angelic beings who had told them he was risen, Jesus' other followers actually dismissed their account as an idle tale. Perhaps these women were suffering from some sort of grief-stricken hallucination. And it's at that point, after the women's witness to the empty tomb, after what they perceived to be their tall tales of angelic beings, our two individuals in today's story decided to hit the road to Emmaus. I can imagine they were feeling a little overwhelmed by all that happened in the last few days, let alone what happened that morning. They just wanted to get out of there. Maybe they needed a break from it all, to take a long walk, to breathe some fresh air, clear their heads. Or maybe they were just done. They had no plans on coming back. I mean, what's the point anyway? Jesus was gone. And can we really blame them? Jesus' ministry didn't end the way they had imagined. The story they found themselves living in wasn't what any of them could have foreseen or planned. And as they walked along, they talked about what happened, about Jesus, his life, his ministry, his death and burial. But as they were walking, they encountered a fellow traveler. It was Jesus, and yet their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And this lone traveler asked them just what it was that they were so engrossed in conversation about. And our friends in the story looked at Jesus like he had two heads. Really? Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about what happened? What are you talking about? Asked Jesus. What happened? And so they proceeded to pour out the whole story to him, telling the traveler about the man, Jesus, who had been a great prophet and yet condemned to death on a cross by the religious leaders. They told this traveler about how Jesus had died only a few short days ago, that they had hoped that this Jesus would be the one to redeem Israel, but that he had been killed instead. And to make matters worse, some of the women who followed Jesus had gone to his tomb that very morning, and the body was gone. The women said they had some sort of vision about angels telling them Jesus was alive, but no one had seen Jesus. So they were pretty sure that the women didn't know what they were talking about. And then the traveler, who they had assumed had no idea about what had taken place, the person they believed had no perspective and no understanding of the story they were living in at all, started to teach them a different point of view, a new perspective on the story they had experienced and were currently living in. What if everything happened just like it was supposed to? What if everything they had experienced pointed to something different than they had assumed? What if everything that happened confirmed that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah, the one they had been waiting for? What if, instead of the end of things, the last few days were just the beginning? And all of a sudden, our two individuals on the road to Emmaus had a whole new perspective about all they had seen, believed, and experienced. And they came near to the resting place, and they invited that traveler to join them. So he did join them. And as they were gathered around the table together, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. And it is in that instance where their eyes are opened, where the two men on the road to Emmaus realized that their unexpected travel companion had been Jesus. But as soon as they recognized Jesus, he vanished right before their eyes. And then they saw it, the big picture, so much more than they had seen before they left for Emmaus, more than they had seen along the road with their new companion. They had been with the risen Lord this whole time. And I'd like to imagine that the followers of Jesus' eyes got really wide like little Wyatt's did, because they realized that the person they had thought they were with wasn't who they were with at all. They hadn't been traveling with some stranger. They had been traveling with Jesus. And I'm sure after he vanished, they were a little freaked out. Did you know that was Jesus? That was Jesus? We were with Jesus. How did we not realize that it was him? Didn't our hearts burn within us when he was explaining the scriptures to us on the road? How did we not realize it was him? So instead of getting a good night's sleep, our two men left where they were staying to return to Jerusalem. They knew that they needed to tell Jesus' other followers all about what they had experienced. Jesus was risen. But when they arrived to the place where the followers of Jesus had been staying, before they could even get a word out, they were met with cries from the other disciples. The Lord has risen. Simon has seen him. And then our two travelers who had been on the road to Emmaus were able to add their witness and their story to the mix, to share about their own experience of the risen Jesus. Sometimes we can become so familiar with the stories in our biblical text that we can forget what it must have been like for the characters in these stories. What it would have been like to not know the end of the story. And because of that, we can be a bit smug about how we would have handled the situation. But the reality is that you and I are in the middle of our own stories of faith. We are living out our lives of faith from limited perspectives. None of us knows the end of our stories yet. And yet, like the characters in our stories today, we will only be afforded a bird's eye view when it's all over. No matter how well we think we see things or how good of a perspective we think we have, there will always be things that we won't know. We are all doing the best we can with what we have, and sometimes we will get it right, and sometimes we will get it horribly wrong. And that's okay, because I have good news for us. We are not on our own. Just as Jesus shows up again and again to stir the faith of his followers, so too does Jesus still show up in our lives, prodding us, teaching us, inspiring us to faith again. And like our travelers on the road to Emmaus, we often don't realize it was Jesus until the moment has almost passed. And Jesus still shows up for the doubters, for the ones who hear reports of God at work and yet disbelieve them because they need more proof. Jesus still shows up for those who feel lost, fed up, disappointed with faith and religion, those who need to take a long walk to clear their head. Jesus still shows up and reveals himself to those who are marginalized, whose testimony others won't believe because society has deemed them unimportant. Jesus still shows up to teach and provide a new perspective to those of us who think that we know it all and that we have it all figured out. And I don't know about you, but I am grateful for a God who will show up again and again, for a God who strengthens my faith when I feel like I might be losing it. We are all in a season of great uncertainty, not sure when things will get back to normal again, not sure of what's next, just like Jesus' disciples. But as Jesus showed up for his disciples, so too will Jesus show up for us today and provide us with a new perspective that we need. And when you and I catch glimpses of the risen Christ, when you and I gain new perspectives, I hope that we will run back to our faith communities and share the ways that we have encountered the risen Christ, alive and well in our world. And may we inspire others to faith again. Amen.
Please join me in singing hymn 364, Because He Lives. God sent his Son, they called him Jesus. He came to love, heal and forgive. He lived and died
Continue to faithfully support our church community with your prayers, virtual and physically distant presence, gifts, service, and witness. I just want to remind you of the ways that you can continue to support the church financially in this season. You can mail in your tithes and offerings to the church's P.O. Box account. You can set up automatic bill pay through your bank, or you can give online through PayPal on our website. Thank you for the ways that you continue to support the mission and ministry of this community. Although our building is closed, I can assure you that the church is open. Our community is still actively striving to worship and celebrate, to serve others, to grow in our faith, and create meaningful and lasting friendships.
I'm going to be singing a very old Easter hymn, O Sons and Daughters. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. O sons and daughters, let us sing. The King of heaven, the glorious King, o'er death today was triumphing. Alleluia. That when the apostles met in fear, amidst them came their Lord most dear, and set my peace beyond all here. Alleluia. 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 When Thomas first the tidings heard that they had seen the risen Lord, he doubted the disciples' word. Alleluia. My pierced sight, O Thomas, see, and look upon my hands, my feet, not faithless but believing be. Alleluia. 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 No longer Thomas then denied. He saw the feet, the hands, the side. You are my Lord and God, he cried. Alleluia. How blessed are those who have not seen, and yet whose faith has constant been, for they eternal life shall win. Alleluia. 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 Alleluia.
I leave you with this benediction. May you and I encounter the risen Christ when our faith is failing and when we are unsure. Go out this day knowing that God is searching for you.
Please join us in our closing song, Just a Closer Walk with Thee.